The struggle for the plains. How the plains were won and lost. This is a tricky unit, there's no denying it, and there was loads and loads that you need to make sure that you know. Again, I cannot include everything, but what I'll try and do is include the majority of the information that you need, but obviously I'll heads up where you need to include something else. So, the Permanent Indian Frontier was what this unit is about. Is about kind of bringing together how did the Indians finally lose control. And it's looking at the final battles, the final struggles before the whites totally established control. The Permanent Indian Frontier was established in 1832, and this was something that was supposed to be the separation between the whites and the Indians, but it was constantly being moved back, it was constantly being crossed. There were various different points and stages within the process which are synonymous with defeat. So, for example, the contact with the early settlers and the mountain men wasn't horrific. The mountain men kind of lived alongside the Indians, but the gold rush was destructive. It was found in areas of Indian land, and it brought across over 90,000 settlers, and it was the kind of the first nail in the coffin, really. The problem was that the whites and the Indians were never ever going to be able to live side by side. There were fundamental differences in their religions, in their beliefs, in their ideals, which meant that these two groups of people were never going to get on. And when you add into it army insensitivity, army incompetence, the army didn't really understand the Indians, the government didn't understand the Indians, and they made no effort to. And then in addition to that, you add in treaties such as the Fort Laramie treaties, which meant that they were constantly being broken. So the Indians would agree to a treaty, and then it would be broken. The Indians would agree to move back, and then the whites would want some more. And so this whole system, the whole wave, this whole cycle of the Indians agreeing to a treaty, the whites agreeing to a treaty, and then it being broken, and the Indians again, went on for ages and ages. So, there were two different views of the Indian problem, okay? Well, the fact that the Indians were seen as a problem is a problem in itself, but there were the group of people who thought that the Indians, as a race almost, should be exterminated, that they should be almost got rid of, that they should ensure that their existence wasn't there anymore. And these people felt that what they should do was that the Indians as a race, as a religion, shouldn't have to exist anymore, so to speak, and that they should have to move forward. The negotiators thought that the Indians could be worked with, that the Indians were a group of people who they felt they could work with and they could bring around to their way of thinking, so to speak. And that's really, really important to note, this whole idea of the exterminators and the negotiators. The negotiators thought that they should be allowed to have their reservations, they should be allowed to have their way of life, and they thought that aggressive tactics would only make the Indians more hostile, whereas the exterminators wanted the government to hand over the Indian problem to the US Army, that action should be taken, should be harsh, should be swift. And so, for example, these people were very happy when the government ordered the slaughter of the buffalo, and this meant that the Indians couldn't actually survive any longer. So, what I'm going to talk you through now very briefly are all the different plains wars that took place. 1862, Little Crow's War, okay? A revolt against reservations. Remember, this government had this policy which stepped up, so it went from separation to concentration to reservation to destruction. And in the reservation system, remember, these were government-run reservations. There was a revolt against the reservations led by Little Crow. Life on the reservations was hard. Compensation that had been promised didn't arrive, and he felt he'd been made a fool of. He'd agreed to all these terms, another example of how he'd agreed to the terms of the treaty, and he'd been made a fool of. So he attacked the agency which ran the reservations, and these attacks continued for 3 months. All that did was it meant that they were rounded up and moved to an even smaller reservation. So the reservation system was flawed beyond belief. In 1863, you come across the Sand Creek Massacre. 1863, Fort Wise Treaty, Chief Black Kettle agreed to move his people to the Sand Creek Reservation. Conditions on this reservation were appalling. The land was shocking. They couldn't grow anything, and their people were starving. And they began to attack wagon trains of the white settlers. Now, they didn't attack them for the sake of it. They attacked them because they were starving. Now, whether that's right or whether that's wrong, who are we to judge? But it wasn't just complete barbarism. So they began to attack the wagon trains for food and began stealing cattle. As a result of this, the army was sent in, and the story goes that the army was sent in, the Indians waved a white flag, and yet they went in and they killed not only the soldiers but also women and children. And some people would suggest that it was a victory for the US Army. Some people suggest that it was actually a massacre. Okay, the massacre, this Sand Creek massacre, that's the word I choose to use, meant that attacks now became a war on white settlements. The Indians had guns, and it really, really unsettled things. They tried to make peace at the Medicine Lodge Creek in 1867, but they were put on an even smaller reservation. In Red Cloud's War is slightly different. Gold was discovered in the Rocky Mountains, which was a trail right through the Sioux hunting grounds. Their territory had been guaranteed underneath the Fort Laramie Treaty, but the Sioux were not happy with this at all. The army were building forts, and they began to attack and joined with Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. So remember, we're talking about the Sioux now. The Sioux killed a detachment of soldiers which had been led by Colonel Fetterman, and the government agreed to withdraw the army and abandon the forts. But the Second Fort Laramie Treaty in 1868 created the Great Sioux Reservation, which included, and this is important, the sacred lands of the Black Hills of Dakota, but not everybody agreed, leading to future conflict. The Winter Campaign of 1868. Okay, the Indians never fought in the winter. They didn't like fighting in the winter. So Sherman, recall Custer and Sheridan, they went to launch a cattle attack on Black Kettle's village, the Battle of Washita. You have the Plains War, where the Sioux went back on the warpath because gold, remember, they'd been given it as their sacred ground, was found in the Black Hills of Dakota, and they were ordered back to their reservation and actually refused to go to do so. And this is where the Battle of the Little Bighorn comes in. I haven't got time to go through all the Battle of the Little Bighorn. What you need to do is you need to go and you need to revise it. You need to revise what happened and the decisions that General Custer took. So why did he ignore the warnings? Why did he go off on his own? And what happened as a result of that? What I will talk about is the aftermath of the battle. Oh, the phone's going off. It stopped going off. I'll carry on. The Battle of Little Bighorn. Again, go away and revise exactly what happened. But I will talk about this whole concept of, was it actually a victory? Okay. In the short term, I've just taken the phone off the hook. In the short term, yes, it was a victory for the Indians. They trounced. There was no one came alive from the Battle of Little Bighorn. But it meant that the US Army were desperate for revenge. They felt absolutely, completely and utterly humiliated. And all Indian reservations were placed underneath military control. So any freedom that anybody had was now taken away from them. All the Sioux were forced into reservations. Crazy Horse, the leader, was taken into custody and later murdered. And all the Indians suffered from the anger of the army, and everybody had to obey the US law. So basically, even though the Indians won the Battle of Little Bighorn, protecting the sacred hills of Dakota and the Black Hills of Dakota, it actually meant that they lost the eventual battle. It was the thing that put the nail in the coffin, so to speak. So, what happened after Little Bighorn? Right, well, life on the reservations was incredibly hard. They had to try and adjust to that life. Okay. Soon afterwards, in 1887, came the Dawes Act, and what this did was this took the remaining Indian land and divided it into 160-acre allotments. Now, if you think about the fact that the homesteaders were offered 650 odd acres, obviously 160 acres isn't a lot. Some of this was given to the Indians, but an awful lot of it was given to white settlers. The Indians were now being told they had to learn how to become farmers. Remember, they didn't believe in farming. They didn't believe in working the earth. They believed that the earth was their mother, so to speak. By 1900, the Indians' land and the land that they were in control of had been reduced from 155 million acres to just 78 million. And their lifestyle had been absolutely destroyed. They were expected to become white farmers. And their their opportunities to show their skills and their courage, their tribal culture, had no meaning at all. As a result of this, the Indians were kind of easy prey. They were almost a little bit unhinged. And as a result of that came up the strange cult of the ghost dance. The ghost dance began in Nevada, where an Indian, Paiute Indian called Wovoka, began to tell people that a time was coming when the white people would leave the land and the Indian dead would return. They would recover their homelands and live as they had to before. To bring this about, they were told they had to perform the ghost dance that would put them into touch with the great spirit. So remember, we're back to their spiritual beliefs, their beliefs in dances. All this ghost dance did was make them restless. It made the Indians think, some of them, because of their beliefs, that there was a chance that this might all end, and they became restless, they became aggressive, and this eventually led to the Battle of Wounded Knee, where soldiers were attempting to disarm a band of Sioux, who were led by Chief Bigfoot, and they killed 153 men, women and children. And some people say that the army wanted to kill the Indians. Some people say that the Indians were kind of very aggressive, but it was the final act. It was the last act in what is essentially a massive human tragedy. The frontier was closed. The Indian frontier was closed by 1890, and you get to the end of the century and Manifest Destiny has been fulfilled. The Indians have put up a brave fight, but essentially their way of life, their land, everything has been taken away from them. When you're revising, I'm not saying you need to know every single detail of every single battle, but in particular make sure you look at the Battle of Bighorn and the massacre at Sand Creek, okay, and have an appreciation of the what I've just talked through, of the processes that took place, the different battles, and like the final outcomes, such as the ghost dance and the Battle of Wounded Knee. So why did the Indians lose the battle for the plains? Number one, Manifest Destiny policy that meant the white were almost hell-bent on taking over the plains. They had this God-given right to populate the plains. Number two, differences in culture, religious and spiritual differences such as scalping, polygamy, spirits, nomadic nature, attitudes to ownership of land. So remember, the Indians believe that you shouldn't own the land and that you can't farm it, that kind of thing. There are the government acts such as the Homestead Act, the Timber Culture Act, reservation policy, role of army, destruction of buffalo. The government wanted to destroy the Indians, and that's very, very important. The end of the Civil War meant that many soldiers needed a new start in life, and the West offered this opportunity and gave the government more money to spend. The homesteaders took land that had been used by the buffalo. The US Army protected them, and there were a large number of settlers, and a civilising influence. They encouraged more people to settle. The cattle ranchers, again, they took land away from the Indians and came into conflict with the Indians. The organisation of the Indians themselves, they were fragmented. There was different tribes, different leaders, different approaches. They didn't believe in long campaigns, and they wouldn't spend months and months at war, so they were always at a disadvantage. Gold was responsible for a huge lot of land. You only have to look at what happened in California, but also the Black Hills of Dakota. When gold was discovered there, that was the catalyst. That was the beginning of the end in the Battle of the Little Bighorns. That brought miners and it brought conflict. Railways cut across the land, improved communication for the whites, destroyed the buffalo's breeding grounds and brought settlement. The Indian tactics, things like counting coup, they couldn't replace the losses. They were less well armed and they believed in a different type of battle, like counting coup. The reservations led to a loss of control and a loss of power, and the destruction of the buffalo meant that the Indians couldn't maintain their way of life. The US Army was too powerful for the Indians and had better strategies and better tactics. Factors, okay. What you need to focus on in your answering the questions in the American West is you need to focus upon how reasons, that's what it focuses on in section B, focuses on reasons. So things like the railways come into nearly every question, okay? They have an impact on nearly everything. Manifest Destiny underpinned everything that the American government did, okay? The government, essentially, it was the actions of the American government which ended the Indians. This comes into every single unit, particularly when you look at things like the Homestead Act, law and order, the struggle for the plains. The army, the actions of the army had a vital role to play, and the difference in lifestyle, the fundamental differences between these two groups, meant that they were never, ever, ever going to get on, and you must remember that at all times, okay?